Right now, oil tankers are sitting motionless in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has just been hit with the largest military strike since the invasion of Iraq. 20% of the world's oil supply is trapped inside an active war zone. Markets open in 6 hours, and while every analyst on television is fixating on oil prices, one country is quietly positioned to generate extraordinary wealth from this crisis. And it is not the country you are probably thinking of. It is Canada. Before you move on, stay with me for 30 seconds because what I am about to walk you through is Canada transforming from America's dependable neighbor into the most consequential energy player on the planet in less than a week. Let's go back 72 hours to Saturday morning, February 28, 2026. The United States and Israel launched major coordinated combat operations against Iran. Hundreds of targets were struck across Tehran, Isfahan, and Karg Island. Reports emerged that Iran's supreme leader was killed inside his own palace. Iran's response was immediate. Missiles struck United States bases across Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Saudi Arabia reported that its oil-producing provinces were targeted. Then the reports no one wanted to see began flooding in. Iran was mobilizing forces around the Strait of Hormuz. Oil had already jumped 3.7% on Friday, based solely on the threat of conflict, with Brent crude closing at $72 a barrel. Analysts had been projecting a spike to $80 when markets reopened on Sunday. But now the conversation was no longer about $80. It was about $100 a barrel. Some voices were whispering about spikes to 110 or even 120, with no sign of de-escalation. 1/5 of the world's oil flows through that 30-mile channel, 13 million barrels per day, plus 5 million barrels of refined petroleum products, and LNG shipments powering entire continents. All of it now sitting inside a war zone. Major oil companies did not reduce shipments through the strait. They suspended them entirely. Not a slowdown, a complete halt. They would not risk tankers anymore. Every country began scrambling. Europe panicked about energy security. Asia started rerouting supply chains. The United States launched a full-scale war with strategic petroleum reserves already sitting at historically low levels. But that is not the real story. The real story is unfolding 7,000 miles from Tehran. While Iran burns, while the strait becomes a parking lot, while oil prices climb vertically, Canada's Prime Minister is not in Ottawa drawing up emergency plans. He is in New Delhi, meeting with Prime Minister Modi, not for ceremonial photo opportunities, not for diplomatic courtesy calls. He is signing deals, energy agreements, uranium supply arrangements, critical mineral partnerships, the kind of agreements that typically require years of negotiation. He is closing them in 72 hours. Mark Carney is not a career politician stumbling through a geopolitical crisis. He is the former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, and former United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. He knows precisely what he is doing. And right now, he is executing what may be the most sophisticated geopolitical strategy playing out anywhere in the world. While Trump launches military operations and threatens tariffs, while China locks down its own energy supply chains, while Europe scrambles to replace Russian gas, Canada has quietly positioned itself as the only major energy producer that virtually every country on Earth genuinely trusts. Think about what that means. Saudi Arabia is now directly in Iran's crosshairs and has become unreliable. Russia is sanctioned, weaponized its energy exports, and permanently destroyed its credibility as a supplier. Iran is being bombed. Iraq sits too deeply within Iran's sphere of influence. The United States just demonstrated it will launch military operations against any country based on a policy decision that could shift with a single social media post. But Canada is a stable democracy with rule of law, has never weaponized its exports, holds the third largest oil reserves on the planet, ranks as the fourth largest producer, outputs 5 million barrels per day, and operates with production costs between $40 and $60 per barrel. That is very comfortable math when oil is heading toward $100. In 2025, Canada exported 4.2 million barrels per day, and almost all of it flowed to the United States at significant discounts, 96% going south to a single buyer. That is not a partnership. That is a dependency. Or it was. Carney is changing that equation right now, and Modi is not a difficult sell. India is the fastest growing major economy on the planet, with a desperate and growing need for energy, particularly nuclear energy. According to sources tracking the New Delhi meetings, on March 2nd, Carney and Modi are finalizing a uranium supply agreement worth $2.8 billion Canadian dollars over 10 years. Canada produces approximately 8,000 tons of uranium annually, making it the world's second largest producer. By 2026, Canada is positioned to control nearly a quarter of global uranium production. Saskatchewan's Athabasca Basin alone accounts for roughly 20% of worldwide supply, with ore grades that are extraordinary. The McArthur River Mine and Cigar Lake are producing uranium at 16% ore grade, while the global average sits below 1%. Canadian uranium is not just abundant, it is exceptionally profitable to extract. India has a massive nuclear expansion program underway and needs exactly what Canada produces. Canadian pension funds have already invested $73 billion in Indian infrastructure, meaning the relationship, the trust, and the capital flows were already established. What Carney is now doing is converting that economic foundation into long-term strategic partnerships that are signed, sealed, and funded. India needs energy security that does not run through the Strait of Hormuz. Canada is delivering exactly that. But uranium is only the beginning. Sources confirm Carney is also negotiating liquefied natural gas exports, targeting 50 million tons flowing to Asia annually, along with critical minerals. India needs these for technology manufacturing, battery production, and a modern industrial economy. Canada produces 10 of the 12 minerals NATO has designated as defense critical, including gallium, germanium, graphite, and tungsten, minerals where China currently dominates global markets. India does not want that dependency. Neither does the United States. Ironically, neither does Europe. All of them are searching for an alternative supplier. Canada raised its hand. Critical mineral production in Canada increased by 10% across 9 minerals in 2024, with exploration spending reaching $2.1 billion, representing 51% of all mineral exploration activity in the country. Modi is not simply buying commodities, he is purchasing insurance. Energy security, supply chain stability, and the kind of reliability you simply cannot get from regions that keep erupting into conflict. Now let's talk about the American miscalculation, because this is where the story takes a critical turn. On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court struck down Trump's emergency tariffs in a 6-3 decision. The court's message was clear: emergency powers cannot be used to impose arbitrary tariffs. Most countries would consider that a victory for Canada. Except, Trump showed no regard for the Supreme Court's ruling. Within hours, he signed a new executive order, pivoted to Section 122 of the Trade Act, and imposed a new 10% global tariff, which he later raised to 15%. The tariff technically exempts goods compliant with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, so on paper, most Canadian exports should be unaffected. But Trump's sector-specific tariffs remained completely untouched. Steel and aluminum at 50%, automobiles at 25%, softwood lumber at 10%, copper at 50%. These operate under different legal authority as Section 232 national security provisions, and the Supreme Court ruling did not touch them. Then there is the threat that hangs over every negotiation like a blade. Trump signaled a 100% tariff on all Canadian imports if Canada finalized its China trade deal, which Canada did in January. Carney signed it personally. So the United States is simultaneously telling Canada not to trade with its rivals, while also imposing tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber. That is not a trade relationship. That is a hostage situation. And Carney's response has been methodical and deliberate. Fine, Canada will sell to everyone else on the planet. Here is where Trump fundamentally miscalculated. He assumed Canada needed America more than America needed Canada, but the real numbers tell a different story. The United States imported 3.3 million barrels of Canadian oil per day last year, representing 24% of total American refinery throughput. American refineries in the Midwest, the Gulf Coast, and the Rockies were specifically designed and built to process heavy Canadian crude. That is the grade they are calibrated for, and you cannot simply substitute West Texas Intermediate shale oil. Different grade, different specifications, different refining process entirely. Retooling those refineries would take years and cost billions of dollars. When Trump threatens Canada with tariffs, he is directly threatening gasoline prices in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Ohio, swing states he cannot afford to lose. Carney knows this. That is why he is in New Delhi instead of Washington. The message is not a plea to avoid tariffs. The message is a demonstration of what it costs America if those tariffs go forward. On January 16, 2026, Carney was in Beijing, becoming the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit China in 8 years. The relationship had been frozen since 2018, following the Huawei arrest and the expulsion of diplomatic staff. Carney thought it in 4 days. The terms were significant. China dropped canola seed tariffs from 84% to 15%, effective March 1st, reopening a $4 billion market that had been completely shut. Saskatchewan and Alberta farmers regained their largest customer. China also removed retaliatory tariffs on canola meal, lobsters, crabs, peas, and resumed beef and pet food trade, representing another $2.6 billion in previously frozen exports. In exchange, Canada allowed 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles entry at a 6.1% tariff instead of 100%. But even more significant than the China deal is what Carney is building called the Pacific Energy Corridor, a systematic restructuring of where Canadian energy flows. The Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion became operational in May 2024, raising capacity from 300,000 barrels per day to 890,000. Canadian oil now flows to Canada's Pacific coast, loads onto tankers, and heads to Asian refineries paying global market prices. Before Trans Mountain, Canadian producers were economically trapped. The only buyers were American refineries, and those buyers knew it, paying whatever price they chose, typically at massive discounts. The Western Canadian Select versus West Texas Intermediate price spread at its worst saw Canadian producers receiving $40 less per barrel simply because they had no other market access. Trans Mountain permanently changed that dynamic, and critically, the pipeline does not cross American territory. It is entirely Canadian infrastructure, completely outside the reach of American tariff leverage. After India, Carney travels to Australia, then Japan, then South Korea, constructing the Pacific Energy Corridor, one partnership at a time. Australia has critical minerals. Japan needs energy security and wants to reduce its dependence on China for rare earth elements. South Korea faces the same situation. All of them are watching the Middle East burn and reaching the same conclusion. They need reliable structural alternatives right now, not tactical emergency reserves. Canada is the only country currently delivering at scale. According to Canadian government trade data, formal critical mineral cooperation frameworks have been established with Germany and Australia, not exploratory conversations, but long-term strategic partnerships with signed frameworks. The LNG Canada project alone represents 12 million tons of annual export capacity, nearly doubling Canada's current LNG export ceiling, with a target startup of 2029 that has been fast-tracked through Canada's Major Projects Office. Canada is not just signing energy deals, it is building an entirely new export architecture that bypasses the United States and funding the infrastructure to sustain it over decades. Two specific financial vehicles are being deployed. The first is the First and Last Mile Fund, $1.5 billion from 2026 to 2030, specifically designed to connect critical mineral deposits to export infrastructure. Having lithium in the ground means nothing without rail lines to ports. Having rare earths in Saskatchewan means nothing without logistics networks reaching Asian battery factories. The second is a Critical Mineral Sovereign Fund, $2 billion over 5 years, not for exploration, but for strategic equity investments in mining companies, offtake agreements, and debt instruments. In practice, Canada tells mining companies it will guarantee purchasing their production for 10 years at a fixed price. That removes the single greatest risk in resource development. Companies have guaranteed buyers. Banks have guaranteed revenues. Projects that could never secure financing suddenly become viable, and Canada holds equity stakes in all of them. For 150 years, Canada's economic model was straightforward. Extract resources from the ground, sell them to America, watch America convert them into finished products, and occasionally buy some back. It was a colonial economy in everything but name. Raw material supplier with no pricing power, entirely at the customer's mercy. Carney is dismantling that model in real time. Canada will still extract resources, but now it sells to the highest bidder, rather than simply the most convenient one. It processes some domestically. It takes equity positions in the companies doing the processing. It uses the resulting profits to build more infrastructure that reduces dependency on any single customer. The numbers reflect this shift. Critical mineral production rose 10% across 9 minerals in 2024, including aluminum, graphite, lithium, magnesium, molybdenum, niobium, platinum group metals, scandium, and uranium. Exploration spending reached $2.1 billion, and that was with oil prices relatively modest compared to where they are now heading. When oil reaches $100 per barrel, when uranium demand goes exponential as every country with serious climate goals builds nuclear capacity, when every government scrambles to lock down critical mineral supply chains, Canada will generate revenues that are difficult to overstate. And the most significant part of all is that there is very little Trump can do about it. He can impose tariffs on Canadian exports, and Canada sells to India, China, Japan, and Europe. He can threaten to dismantle trade agreements, and Canada builds bilateral arrangements directly with individual American states whose economies depend on Canadian crude. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota will force their congressional delegations to push back forcefully if Canadian oil stops flowing to their refineries. For 80 years across the entire post-World War II era, the global order operated on a specific logic. The United States sat at the undisputed center. Countries seeking security aligned with Washington. Countries seeking market access followed American rules. Countries wanting financial stability worked through the dollar system. Canada, within that framework, was the textbook middle power, respected and influential in specific domains, but fundamentally operating in America's shadow. That world has now ended. The Iran crisis is not simply a Middle East conflict with oil market implications. It is definitive proof that the old energy order is broken. For 50 years, global energy security rested on Middle Eastern stability, OPEC price management, and United States Navy guarantees of freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has now demonstrated the strait can be threatened and potentially closed. The United States has demonstrated it will launch full-scale military operations with minimal warning. Saudi Arabia has demonstrated vulnerability to missile strikes on its oil infrastructure. The entire foundation of global energy security has turned to quicksand. Every country watching this unfold is reaching the same conclusion. They need structural alternatives, not tactical hedges or emergency reserves, but a fundamental rewiring of where their energy comes from and who can actually be trusted to deliver it reliably over the long term. Canada combines three qualities no other major energy producer currently offers simultaneously. First, massive, proven, and economically viable reserves, ranking third globally in oil, second in uranium, and holding top-tier critical mineral deposits that are not speculative but documented and actively producing. Second, political stability through democratic governance, rule of law, peaceful transfers of power, and no risk of revolution, military coups, or nationalization of foreign assets. Third, a complete absence of any history of weaponizing exports. Canada has never cut off energy supply for political leverage, never threatened a trading partner using resources as a weapon, and never used market access as a negotiation tactic. That combination is rare and extraordinarily valuable in the current environment. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement comes up for mandatory review on July 1, 2026, as written into the deal. Trump is already signaling he wants fundamental changes, including renegotiated terms favoring American manufacturing, restrictions on Canadian trade with China, and pricing concessions benefiting American buyers. Old Canada would have sent delegations to Washington to negotiate from a position of dependency. The Canada Carney is building is prepared to walk away from sufficiently punishing terms, not from trade with America entirely, since the economic integration runs too deep, but from the formal framework itself, if Trump's demands become extreme. Because Carney now has real alternatives, not theoretical future partnerships, but signed agreements with payments already flowing. If the agreement collapses, American refineries in the Midwest lose access to Canadian crude they cannot readily replace, and gasoline prices rise in exactly the states whose voters Trump cannot afford to alienate. Meanwhile, Canadian oil flows to India, China, Japan, and Europe at global market prices rather than the discounted rates American buyers had grown accustomed to paying. Canada's diversification is real and functional. America's alternatives for Canadian heavy crude do not exist at the required scale. 5 years from now, when analysts examine how the global power structure shifted and how American dominance evolved into a genuinely multipolar world, they will point to this moment, February and March of 2026, the Iran war, the energy crisis, Trump threatening his closest allies with economic warfare, and Canada quietly and methodically constructing an alternative architecture of global trade, deal by deal, barrel by barrel, and ton of uranium at a time.